right. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome, everyone. So glad you can join us today for Mathing Out Loud, how student talk can accelerate learning for all students. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Joseph Hyun. I'll be one of your facilitators today. About me, I taught high school math for 11 years at Morse High School in San Diego, California. And I've had the opportunity to support teachers and school leaders for the past 3 years with TeachFX. I'm joined by NCTM President Kevin Dykema, Utah State Board of Education Secondary Math Specialist Lindsey Henderson, instructional coach Jackie Ricks, and math teacher Kristen Reuter from our partner school, Brighton High School. I want to give a chance for the facilitators to all introduce themselves, and everyone take a look at the chat. It's like a waterfall now. We've got folks from all over the place. Thank you all so much for joining today for this conversation. For each of our panelists, I'm actually hoping that you can share a little bit about your educator's story. Maybe give like a 30 to 60-second introduction about how you found yourself to be where you are today, and maybe your interest in this discussion topic of mathing out loud. Kevin, why don't I turn it over to you to introduce yourself?
Thank you. So I'm Kevin Dykema, and I have the privilege of currently serving as the president for the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, which is the world's largest professional organization focused on PK to 12 math. Prior to this role, I served as an eighth grade math teacher in Southwest Michigan for over 25 years. In that role, I quickly realized as a brand new teacher, my students didn't want to just sit there and listen to me talk and tell them what to do. I would hear things like, "This is stupid. Why are we doing this?" They were disengaged. And I realized I needed to increase the amount of discourse if I was going to keep my students really engaged with that. So I've made a career of trying to keep my students engaged through that discourse, and it develops so much understanding. And we'll talk more about that later, but I think it's really, I realized standing in front and talking just does not work for students, and I need to do things differently.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Let's hear from Lindsey Henderson next.
My name's Lindsey Henderson. I am this Utah State Board of Education secondary math specialist. I've done tons of things in my life. It's probably part of my ADD. I've been a classroom teacher. I taught all the maths from middle school all the way to high school. I taught it at all the schools in Salt Lake City School District. I even the school that where High School Musical is filmed. That was the last high school I was at, East High in Salt Lake City. Amazing place. And then I kind of transitioned over into some ed tech startups and was a STEM specialist. And I have a math and a science background, and that was a lot of fun, and started my own little business as well. And then I went into district leadership, and this role opened, and I took it at the state level. I love talking about student discourse because, like Kevin, I just saw a real need to make discourse is a way for me to have students actively engaged in constructing mathematics experiences and knowledge. And so it's really important to me to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. Let's go to Kristen next.
I'm Kristen Reuter. I have been a math teacher for 19 years, primarily high school math. And I think that talking is important. Math talking, well, all talking is important, but math talking as well, and the students talking particularly. It's a good way to see what they're thinking, how they are deriving their answers. It's a good way to help pinpoint where their conceptual errors are and to get them more engaged in the classroom.
Thanks, Kristen. And let's wrap up with Jackie.
Hi, I'm Jackie Ricks. I am an instructional coach. Realized this morning that I'm a full-fledged adult in education now, 18 years. I started at a juvenile detention center and then worked at a residential treatment center and then a Title I turnaround school. And I was so privileged in all of those opportunities to really get to focus on student learning rather than testing. I thought that was just an incredible way to get to start my career. And then at the Title I turnaround school, we spent 2 years working on inquiry-based instruction and moved the school from failing to a B school in 2 years. So it was an incredible experience to be part of. We had some great training from Sterling Hilton, a BYU math professor. And so I guess that's how I crossed from my social studies background over to being able to discuss inquiry and math.
Thank you so much to each of our facilitators today for introducing yourselves. I see now that we're at 72 people. And so if you weren't here for the start, you are here at Mathing Out Loud. Thank you so much for your attendance. If you haven't yet dropped your name and your role and location in the chat, just as I'm scrolling through, it looks like we have so many different roles, from in the classroom to supporting teachers to math specialists and district and school leaders all across the country. So it's so great to have you here today. My name is Joseph. I'm also one of your facilitators, and I'm the head of partner success at TeachFX. I taught high school math. That's where my background, how I got started in education. But it's been my honor to really be able to support schools and teachers and departments with trying to elevate student voice in their classrooms. And I recognize a few of you here on the call today. So great to have you here. Before we get started with our session agenda, I'd love to just share why we're hosting this conversation today. TeachFX, we try to help teachers get students talking. We know that student talk is a mechanism for accelerating learning. So what we do is we show teachers objective insights into how much student talk is happening and which of their teaching moves lead to those moments in their lessons. We also support teachers with inquiry-based workshops. That's the kind of work that I get to do with schools. And we help them both learn and experience the kinds of teaching practices that help create more conversational classrooms. And we're working with partners, again, throughout the country. And we're lucky to be able to support so many educators in the state of Utah, Lindsey's state, including Jackie and Kristen, two of our facilitators today. So today, here's what we're going to do. Here's the outline. We're going to explore with our panelists 3 topics. First, we want to learn how inquiry-based math instruction can incite curiosity, unlock brilliance, and accelerate learning for all students. I think that's why we're all here, to be able to achieve those things. But second, we want to get into how engagement mindsets of instructional leaders and teachers, like all of you on the call today, can foster that student talk in math classrooms. Lastly, we want to look at how a focus on leading indicators of learning, like student talk time or teacher questioning, can actually help pave the way for mathing out loud in every classroom. So throughout our session today, we're going to share the research that supports these approaches. And I want each of our panelists to share their experiences from the classroom, as well as with TeachFX and beyond. The intention here today is that all of you get to leave today with actionable ideas for how you can use these strategies to accelerate learning in math classrooms with student talk, whether you're in the classroom or you're supporting teachers in their classrooms. So we're all math educators here. Let's start by looking at some of the data. Nationwide, I'm not sure if everyone knows this or has seen these reports, but post-pandemic math scores, they're showing the largest decline since 1990, which is when the NAEP was first administered. In fact, student math scores took a sharp decline after the pandemic everywhere and for all grade levels except one place. I'll give you a guess. That's why they're here today, to share some of what they're doing in their classrooms. This happened everywhere except Utah. So Lindsey, I actually want to turn it over to you first. Could you speak a little bit to what's made the difference for Utah's students?
Absolutely, I would love to. First of all, I'd love to celebrate all of the hardworking teachers, parents, and students that we have in our system. I think none of the things that we achieved, and the thing that we achieved was we were the only state to not see a statistically significant decline in pre-pandemic to post-pandemic 8th grade NAEP scores. It's amazing. The only state. Every other state had double-digit declines. The only other entity that achieved what we did was the Department of Defense, which is an interesting system to look at as well. So in our system, I dropped an article in the chat. It's very big, it's complex, it's filled with lots of different moving pieces, but we have several unique features that set us out from other state systems of education. And those are the things that I like to point out because they're the things that are unique to what we're doing. The first one is we are fully integrated standards statewide. Anybody who receives state funds has to teach integrated standards all the way through high school. We are one of 2 states that has that mandate. I know a lot of places allow people to choose, but that has been we have some data that shows that it's brought some significant opportunities, particularly to our students with disabilities earning their grade level math credit in high school. we've doubled the percentage of students who are earning their grade level math credit, students with disabilities earning their grade level math credit in high school. Another key feature of our system is we try to be asset based. We really work hard and we try to asset frame our system. We think that all students can. We think that all students know something mathematically. That is just, those are no-brainers in our system. And because of those beliefs, we progress all students with their grade level peers in all the way through high school. That's something that is, I haven't heard of another state that does that. I grew up in a system in Utah that held me back until I passed to algebra before I could go on to geometry. In Utah, all ninth grade students take secondary math 1, all 10th grade students take secondary math 2, and all 12th or 11th grade students take secondary math 3. We do have systems of support in place. That's the other unique feature. And we have multiple acceleration opportunities for students who need those options as well. So those are just some of the unique features of our system that I think sets us apart from other places in the United States. And I think that probably those features had an effect on our performance on the 8th grade NAEP.
Thank you, Lindsey. And for all of our attendees today, whether you're working at the state level or district or school level or directly with our students in our classrooms, the whole point here is that we're trying to help our teachers embrace all of our students' capacity to be brilliant mathematicians. So it's helpful to hear what's happening at that state level from Lindsey. But what we want to be able to do is help our teachers make space for what students do know. Instead of a deficit kind of model, how do we help our students build their mathematical understanding more deeply based on what they're bringing and the assets they bring to our classrooms? So a little bit more data. As some of you might know, John Hattie very famously found that teachers on average talk about 80% of the time in their classrooms. And that's across grade levels and subject areas. What you might not know, though, is that TeachFX on our end, we've analyzed 20,000 hours of classroom lessons, and we found that the average student speaks for just 27 seconds per hour of instruction. So now, Kevin, I actually want to turn it over to you because I know you've been so vocal about the importance of discourse in math classrooms. Can you share what has made you such a proponent of student talk?
Yeah, they see it from several different angles. I mean, from the teacher angle, it's so much more fun to have a math class when the students are engaged and they're sitting there and they're having those communications. So it makes it more fun, but it also makes it more worthwhile for me. When I learn to shut my mouth and allow my students to truly share their thoughts with each other and then just share their thoughts and their thinking as a class, I am always wowed and amazed at the mathematical insights that students are bringing to the table. I think so often, for many of us, we may have experienced a very traditional classroom where it was dead silent in math. And, I think about our language arts colleagues. In language arts, you read a passage and then students talk about it. I think about science. Students do an experiment and then they talk about it. In social studies, students were presented with some information, they have a debate, they talk about it. But in math, traditionally, the teacher stands in front and says, this is step 1, step 2, step 3. There's no peer-to-peer interaction. You just sit there and listen to the teacher, and it's not tremendously exciting for the students. They're not engaged. They're busy having discourse in the rest of their day, and it gets to math class, it's that silent class. And we complain about how students are disengaged in math. Let's get them engaged. The best way to get them engaged is that student-to-student discourse. When I think about from NCTM's perspective, when I think about principles to action, and Joseph, if you want to go to that next slide and share that, principles to action is now 10 years old. 10 years. And in the last 10 years, I have yet to hear anybody in the math education community build a compelling argument why one of these 8 should not be there. I have also yet to hear anybody build a compelling argument why there's a 9th one that's missing or a 10th one that's missing. And this is 10 years. And as math educators would say, this is what it needs to be. And we know in education how rare it is that we agree on anything for more than 2 or 3 years. And this is 10 years old. So you see those 8 practices. And to me, it really says 3 things when we arrange them with this arrangement of the 8. That first thing, I need to have a math goal. And I think that math goal is more important for me as the educator than it is for the student. When I'm thinking about increasing the amount of discourse in my classroom, as my students are talking, they may come up with lots of different ideas. I need to know, what is that ultimate goal going to be? so that I can steer that conversation, that whole class conversation, so that we hit that math goal. The second thing this arrangement of 8 really tells me, we need to choose a good problem and choose a good task. If I want my students talking, I need to give them a problem worth talking about. Just saying something that we often do isn't going to engage. I've got to figure out, how can I make some tweaks in what I'm doing? How can I put that onus of responsibility on the students that they're actively engaged in that? The other thing that really strikes me is those bottom 5. And you see those bottom 5, so that's 5 of 8. For those quick in math, that's 62.5%. 5 out of those 8 practices really say the same thing. Get your students talking about math to develop a solid understanding of the math. I am sure that my 8th graders thought I was absolutely crazy the first couple of years of teaching. Now, granted, they still do, but now it's for completely and totally different reasons. Because those first few years of teaching, right in the middle of class, I'd be like, oh, now I get it. And they would all look at me and say, don't you know how to do the problems? And I would often say there's a difference between knowing how and knowing why. And for many of us, we may have grown up in a time, our classrooms might have just been, who cares about understanding why? Just memorize these steps. And there was no discourse, there was no making sense of the mathematics. I want students who are able to make sense of the mathematics. I want them to know the why behind it. When I think about our ever increasing technological world, students can use ChatGPT, students can use PhotoMath, students can use other tools to find the answers to many of the problems that we would just give them if we're looking at math as just straight procedurals and rote understanding or rote memorization of facts and procedures. I want students who are able to get to the understanding stage. And I see that 5 of those 8 are just screaming out at me, get your students talking about math. And when they're talking about math, they're more engaged. They're starting to make sense of the mathematics. It makes it so much more enjoyable for me. Now, let me be clear. My 8th graders often have no difficulties talking during math class because they're talking about the math in math class can be a challenge. It's not a skill set that I felt that I had developed in my undergraduate degree because that's just not what we focused on way back in the Stone Ages. But now we need to be developing those tools. I need to be putting myself out there. I need to be trying different things, trying different strategies, trying different structures to get my students actively engaged, get my students talking. Because when they're talking, the likelihood of them being engaged is much greater than when they're not. The yeah, but that I often hear from teachers is my kids are going to go off task. Yes, they are. Let's face reality. But I often respond, think about us during a staff meeting. How often, when we have to get into our small group to talk about whatever, how often, unless your staff is totally different than mine, my staff, we don't all get right down to business. You have that first 30 seconds where you talk about something else, and then somebody says, hey, wait a minute, what are we supposed to be talking about at this point in time? Our students are going to be that same way, and we just have to acknowledge it, and we have to be comfortable with that. I'd also like to point out that that quiet classroom, that classroom where the kids are just copying down things from the board, copying down those notes, it doesn't mean they're engaged. It doesn't mean they're paying attention. It means that they're busy thinking about everything else. We need to be increasing that amount of discourse. It's difficult. It's a change for so many of us, but it's what our students need. And if we're truly interested in meeting the needs of our students, we've got to be willing to try to do things differently. And I look at using more discourse than what we may have traditionally used in our classrooms. It's so powerful. It allows those students those opportunities to start to make those connections. And it's playing out more fun for me. It's fun for me to see that energy. It's fun for me to hear their explanations and oftentimes they come up with ideas that I wouldn't have come up with. Sometimes I know too much math. My brain jumps straight to come up with an equation for it. And they're just reasoning through different things and they're seeing different connections. It makes math so much more enjoyable. And I want students to recognize that math is both relevant and useful. And just telling them what to do and having them sitting and listening quietly does not help them see the relevance, does not have them see the usefulness. But when I use 5 of those 8 practices and really have them engaged in discourse. Now they're starting to see that relevance. Now they're starting to see that usefulness. So from a national perspective, I had that privilege of working with so many different teachers and so many different educators throughout the nation and in other countries. And it's so exciting to hear stories from people who are really focusing hard on increasing that discourse and the positive results that they're seeing with their students because they're so much more engaged.
Evan, I feel like I could hear what your classroom sounds like, just as you describe the kind of classrooms you're trying to, the kind of environment you're trying to create. I want to call attention to a couple of quotes people are responding to in the chat here, as any of our facilitators are sharing their experiences. If that's something that that resonates with you or that you're connecting with, I definitely invite you to drop your thoughts in the chat. We got a big group here, so I definitely want to find opportunities for you to be able to share what's resonating. If you're on our call today, my guess is that we're here for a common purpose. I think, and again, an assumption here is that we all want to hear and see math classrooms that are just alive with conversation. So the question to me is, how do we help teachers make that happen? And I do want to center the classroom today and hear from our Brighton High School colleagues, Jackie and Kristen, who are here. Kristen, maybe we could start with you. When it comes to inquiry-based math instruction, can you give us a crash course on this? What even is that? How do you define it and how do you know when it's happening?
Well, the inquiry-based is where the kids are asking the questions and they are involved in like a task that presents a problem and they're doing the thinking with it. So it kind of shifts. Sorry, the bell is going and we have 1 minute of music before the bell. So I don't know if you can hear that, but sorry. It's to motivate them to get to class quickly. So inquiry-based is when you're having them look at a problem and they're coming up with their questions and going through it. And you're kind of using questions to guide them to where you want it to be, like Kevin was saying, where you kind of got to think ahead and be like, okay, if I ask this question, they'll go this way. And like, what is your end goal that you want to have out of that? So I probably haven't gone like full-blown inquiry where the kids come up with the questions and then I use that to go to the standards that we have. But I've done a lot of like task-based things and a lot of having them look and see how they get to the pattern and how they came up with that, rather than just here is the pattern.
Huey Bagdoyan, please come to the office.
So you do work at a school, Kristen.
Yep. So I forgot what I was saying, but that's what I've worked on.
Well, I appreciate you sharing kind of the lived experience and the things that you're trying in your classroom this year. I'll actually turn it over to your colleague, Jackie, because I know you support Kristen as well as other teachers. So can you share some of the shifts that you're seeing teachers make this year?
Yeah, so Kristen has done a phenomenal job of being a leader in the school in math-based inquiry instruction. She's really taken heart the building thinking classrooms principles, and we have been working on a strategy called the question formulation technique. And she just mentioned this to me last week, I think, or just the other day, how she tried it 3 times with one class recently, and we're approaching the end of our second trimester. And she said that she noticed that those students who had practiced asking questions got remarkably better at asking questions as time went on. So I wanted to highlight that about her experience. And I think that's what is at the heart of what we're trying to do, is trying to help students learn to ask better questions, and to even be okay asking questions. We do use TeachFX at our school. And with that, though, TeachFX does do a good job of, if you just push record, you're automatically going to increase some student talk, but teachers have really wanted some strategies to increase student talk. So we've been really looking at the questions that our students ask. The other thing that I really started digging into this year was this term from science that I'm going to borrow called the cross-cutting concepts. And science has these 7 principles that cross-cut through each of their content areas, and math has the practice standards. And then we've got thinking like a historian. And the thing that cross-cuts all of the subject areas is inquiry and discussion. And so the questions that we're asking about the subject at hand. Somebody has told me that in my adult life, asking questions is one of my superpowers, but that was not always the case. I had to get better at that. I was afraid of always looking stupid as a kid in high school. And so I think my mission now is to try to help inspire students to feel safe in asking their questions. And maybe the thing that inspired me the most was, as a classroom teacher, trying a Socratic seminar for the very first time ever, and just watching the students explore, helping them prepare to ask the questions. And then afterwards, they were saying, this was the funnest thing I've ever done in school. And I was like, what? Okay. They said, when can we do it again? So then I fell in love with this idea of elevating the student voices in the rooms. I think maybe the scariest piece of it as a teacher is you give up control. You give up some control of the outcome. And you have to get good at predicting what questions students might ask to try to feel comfortable in that environment.
Thank you so much to both Kristen and Jackie for sharing, again, what your experience in the classroom, the kinds of things that you're focusing on. And I love that it's not just questions that we as teachers ask, but even preparing for the kinds of questions that our students will ask and coaching them in that, I think is just so inspiring. In terms of the work that's happening in Brighton, I know that across your district, some of these kinds of practices and other themes are happening across the state of Utah. So Lindsey, I'd love if you can come back in here and share what are the ways that you're supporting districts across the state, and would you be willing to share some of those resources with our participants today?
Oh, absolutely. This is my favorite part of my job, is learning what kind of things I can do at the state level, policy, resources that we can get out there to help support teachers in the classroom and administrators and coaches at the district level. So one of our first primary documents is this Utah's pre-K through 12 mathematics framework. It's 40 pages of golden nuggets, I think. It was created by about 150 stakeholders, all came together. Each of the elements is an evidence-based best practice, and inquiry happens to be one of those. Student discourse happens to be one of those as well. We rely on effect size in Utah. We're really big on that evidence base and inquiry-based. I'll drop a link in the chat. Inquiry-based teaching has an effect size of 0.53, which means it is good. It has good positive outcomes on student learning, and it should be leveraged in the classroom. We also have an evidence-based practice that is called direct instruction or explicit instruction. That is also a high leverage practice as well. I tend to lean on the inquiry side because, like Kevin explained, when I enter secondary math classrooms, I see a lot of teacher talk. I don't see a lot of student talk. And so I try to be on the bandwagon for bringing balance back to the force based on whatever your learning outcomes are. Inquiry and explicit instruction, you shouldn't have to be forced to choose. You shouldn't have to, you have to pick a side. You should be able to use either one based on what you want your learning outcomes to be in the classroom. And so creating these resources helps to get the message out there so that teachers can really engage in some high leverage practices. In our math framework, I get an email probably once a month about, we have an element in there about student talk, and we give percentages that are backed by research. About 20% of class time should be dedicated to teacher talk only, which leaves the other 80% for other things that aren't teacher talk. And so providing, I think TeachFX does a great job in helping teachers to know what to do with the other 80% of that time. Questioning is such a really great, it's a great, I need to hone my questioning skills. It's great for anybody, right, at any level, and especially in mathematics. When I was a teacher in the classroom, one of my favorite things to do was to give groups of students a task that I hadn't even done any direct or explicit instruction on, the mathematics behind it, and put them in groups and just listen to them talk to each other. And as a teacher, I got lots of things. I could figure out what the students' funds of knowledge were. So how could I leverage, and then in my teacher brain, I was like, how can I leverage those to bridge to grade level content? And then I knew how to personalize the next lesson so that groups of students could really get the maximum out of what I was trying to teach. And the best part was I had 0 papers to grade. I was listening. it was an amazing practice and so powerful. And so I always like to challenge teachers to think of discourse as not only an instructional routine, but it sure gives you a lot of information as a teacher. And it's the kind of information that is not, that can't be, you know, you can't put an A on that kind of information. It gives you actual live evidence of what students are doing, what they're grappling with, what tools are they reaching for to solve problems. And it helps you as the teacher know how to personalize. How can I make you more efficient? How can I make you, how can I help you reach this grade level standard that is rather complex? So those are a couple of the resources we have. We also, I'll drop a resource in the chat about when we have guidance on when you should choose explicit instruction or inquiry. I try to do things at the state level that give teachers like Kristen and leaders like Jackie the tools to be innovative in their classroom, to bring in discourse, to bring in inquiries so that students can have rich mathematics experiences.
The chat is blowing up, and I felt like my ears perked up with the 0 papers to grade. I'm guessing some other classroom teachers were thinking the same thing. At this point, kind of going back to our agenda, the second item here is to talk about engagement mindsets. And, you know, you heard from the national level to state level to the classroom level, you know, this idea about inquiry-based instruction. And if you're thinking about, okay, well, how do I do that? I mean, we know that this type of classroom doesn't just happen overnight. It takes work. And there's this mindset that we want to share with all of you today. We call it the engagement mindset. And it's the one that acknowledges that math is not a silent or solitary activity. This idea of what we want math classrooms to sound like and feel like, that they should be alive with discourse. In our opinion, it's going to take both instructional leaders and teachers, like all of you on the call right now, to adopt this kind of mindset. Lindsey, I know you just shared about stuff that's happening at the state level, but I want you to speak to this because I know we've talked about this in the past. You've been quite vocal about the prevalence of this myth that math classrooms should be quiet, or like sit and get, or that math is this quiet or solitary pursuit. Can you share, like, what do you think is behind that way of thinking?
That's a really great question. I guess I haven't done a lot of metacognition on it. I was a late bloomer mathematically. I did not see myself in mathematical spaces or as a doer of mathematics until probably my first year of college. And when I think back to my K-12 experience, the bad experiences are all math related. And so I'm sure I had like, I remember in 4th grade that my mom couldn't even convince me by buying me a Cabbage Patch doll to memorize my times tables. I was obstinate. I would not do it. And then I remember we had to do these timed tests, and my teacher would call our names and we'd have to answer with our score after we corrected them. Well, I wasn't going to memorize my times table, so my score wasn't great. And I just flat out lied about my score because I had to say it out loud in front of people. There have been other experiences too where I didn't feel, I felt like math was done to me. It was up to me to be able to figure out how to use math in my daily life. And so I think it contributed to my being a late bloomer mathematically. And I just feel like discourse and leveraging inquiry, particularly post-pandemic when we have engagement problems and attendance problems at schools, is a really easy way to help entice kids back into the classroom. It's a great way to set the culture when you say, I trust you to talk mathematically to each other. That is huge. That is asset-based. That shows kids that you have high standards for their learning. And just like Kevin said, you're going to get kids that are off topic. But I would say that even if they're off topic and engaging in discourse between each other, there's still some value in that as a learning experience. And so really leveraging ways to set the culture to show that you trust students to engage in these rich discourse activities is really important, and it draws them in to be feeling like they're a part of the classroom. So I could go on, Joseph, it's a soapbox, but I'm going to pause because we have some other amazing panelists that have ideas too.
Absolutely. I wanted to start with you just because I know we've had that conversation, and And I think that there's a lot of common ground, and the chat is blowing up again with responses to what your experience was as a student, which I think is, we talk about ourselves as educators, but we were also all students at one point and continue to be. I actually want to turn it over to the entire audience right now, up to 90 people, and just take a moment of reflection for yourself and consider your own mindset as a teacher, or if you support teachers, or if you're in a school leadership or district leadership role, think about the teachers you're supporting and consider that their mindsets. And honestly, if you're willing to share this in the chat, this is an opt-in question for you. But I want to know, do you think that you or your teachers have this engagement mindset? Why or why not? And if you're not sure, if you need a little bit of support, I'm going to try to give some silent wait time in a moment. Maybe another way to ask this question would be, do you think, well, if you are a teacher, are you assuming, or for teachers that you support, do you think they assume that kids want and can engage in meaningful discourse in classrooms? I'm going to give 10 seconds to just pause so that everyone has some devoted time to consider this idea about engagement mindset. And if you are willing to share authentically in the chat, I welcome that. But let me just give 10 seconds. So as you type your response, again, maybe you're drafting it and you want to see how it looks before you push enter, I invite you to share and be part of this conversation. I wanted to share a little bit about the work that I am honored to get to do with teachers, especially math educators, to develop and broaden this kind of engagement mindset. This whole year in professional development workshops, what I think has actually been really enlightening for teachers, it's this power of triangulating data. Fancy term to just say that there's lots of data out there for teachers to use. And it's this ability to actually help our teachers make sense of all of it to lead to this important outcome, or maybe a shift in mindset that they're capable of. In my opinion, if all, and I'm going to use my own example from when I taught, if all that I have is my memory or my instinct about how I taught, then I'm going to be susceptible to my biases and my good intentions. Because I truly don't think there's any teacher out there that wants students to be disengaged or doesn't want this amazing sounding classroom. And sometimes that good intention can obscure the fact that we might not always be providing that. It creates more blind spots than if we don't have that. So when I've asked teachers these kinds of questions, what I found is something kind of amazing happens when a teacher gets to look at additional data to kind of add to this reflection equation. We'll get to what TeachFX data looks like, but in my opinion, when a teacher gets to see objective data about how much either they're speaking or the ways in which their students are participating, it starts to shift this question about, oh, why is it so hard to get my students talking, to, oh, okay, like here's something I could maybe try to do to get better. And all of a sudden, this engagement mindset turns into growth mindset. And I just think it's so powerful when teachers are empowered like the professionals they are to be able to seek out this kind of growth. I'm going to get off my soapbox because that was a big soapbox for me. I want to turn it over to Jackie and Kristen because, again, I know that you're doing the work in the trenches at Brighton. Jackie, this time I'll start with you. In terms of mindsets, would you be able to share to the kind of shifts that you've been seeing, maybe the assumptions that have changed when it comes to using data or looking at this engagement mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been looking at student talk as our school-wide focus. We're in the middle of year 2, and I am a leader who likes to allow people to jump on the bus whenever they're ready to get on the bus, and they can get off at the next stop if they're uncomfortable. And I just say my job is to keep driving the bus around and let them get on. And so that's kind of the approach that I've taken with this. But I stay on the circuit. I don't drive to a new route. And so I have a teacher who, you always have early adopters, and then you have okay, I've waited it out a little bit, and then you have later adopters. But a teacher in year, can retire any moment, had a water cooler conversation and said, all right, Jackie, how much talk do you want so that you shut up? Like, what are you really looking for? And I said, well, it really depends. It depends on so much. And he said, well, I've been doing a lot more think pair shares. I said, I'm really proud of that. I'm really happy about that. How are you feeling about that? He said he was feeling really good about it. So I just keep on this. And then the other thing that people are saying is that they believe in it, but they also don't know how to get kids. So I work at the high school level, and I saw some students after school yesterday videoing each other and goofing around. And another kid said, delete that, delete that, delete that. And I just thought, how hard would it be right now to live in a world that you could be videoed and put all over the internet at any moment? And so I just thought about these kids who are perhaps scared to speak because they don't want it posted everywhere. And so I do want to recognize the struggle of teaching right now in that environment. And so I have teachers who are deeply invested in this, but also are struggling a little bit because students aren't willing to right away. And so it takes the dedication and practice to keep pushing against that and make it part of your classroom culture, part of your school-wide culture, so that it becomes more accepted, especially in the adolescent brain, if they feel like they're just different in any way. So we want it to be as big a part of the culture as we can. I think that's key. And then I also asked the gentleman with the water cooler conversation, because he said, I've seen all the things come around and around, Jackie. Is this just one of those things? And I said, well, it is one of those things. But don't you think that if this is one of those things, this is the perfect time for it to come around post-COVID? To get students talking, to develop these soft skills that are so important later in life. So I see teachers working hard every day to make this part of their practice, just like Kristen. So I'll turn the time over to her to talk about her experience too.
Thank you, Jackie. And I hope you keep driving that bus. I think it's incredible, the leadership that you bring to Brighton. Kristen, I know in our conversations, we've talked about some of the ways that you're progressing your class through the ideas from building thinking classrooms, which for those of you on the call who have not checked out this book or given it a read, I highly recommend it. Would you mind sharing about your mindset and any changes you've gone through this year?
Yeah, it's been a long road with inquiry-based. I first started with reading concept-based mathematics, which is another really great book. It's by, I opened the tab so I could tell you, Jennifer Wathel. But it was phenomenal. And it started me on that track of the inquiry-based and be like, okay, having them look at it and have those discussions would be beneficial, but it's a very different mindset, and it can be very maybe nerve-wracking as a teacher because you don't have the ability to predict where things are always going to go. Whereas before I'd be like, okay, I'm going to teach him about this thing first, and then I'll show this example here, and then I'll do this example here, and then I'll do this example here. So it was very prescribed. Like I knew what was going to happen. But there were sometimes when like they came up with something and I try and like come up with ways of how they could look at it. But there's been several times when they're like, does this work? And I was like, and I had to like really think it through and try and do like an impromptu proof to be like, does that work all the time, or is there a hitch to that? And so some of those things you can't predict. And so that can be nerve-wracking. So one of the things in the Building Thinking Classrooms book is the tasks. So I've been doing that for several years. And then I morphed from the concept-based mathematics, well, not morphed, but I added more resources from that and did the mathematics vision project that Utah had come out with, and that now has gone to open up resources that has a lot of task-based things. And so I had some really good resources for that. And I found the Building Thinking Classrooms actually through a Facebook group. So if you're not in a Facebook group, there's several really good Facebook groups. I was on one for, I'm on one for Desmos, one for Mathematic, one for, what's the one that actually got me there? I think it was the Desmos one that got me there. And now I'm one for Building Thinking Classrooms. But it's a really great resource to reach out to other people. So if you're like the lone person in your building giving it a shot and you don't have any buy-in from anybody else, like that's a good way to connect with other people and see how it works. So I read that book and I was like, okay, he's done some really good research. Like, it's pretty good. He tried it with a whole bunch of teachers. Like, I'm going to give it a shot and see how it goes. And I was like, I feel hesitant about this because it looks like it could be a little bit chaotic and it doesn't look like a normal, typical classroom. And so I was a little bit nervous about that. And I've really been loving a lot of things that have come out of it. I really love the work on the whiteboards. I feel like the kids do a lot better on the whiteboards. I think it helps with some of that cell phone usage, that when they're standing up at whiteboards, that can help mitigate that problem. And it kind of grew in my building. Just people saw what I was doing in my class. We have pods, and so like you kind of see each other a little bit more. And some people were like, hey, what are you doing with your kids? And I was like, well, I read this book. And so I had some like people try, and then I reached out to my district specialist person. And I was like, you got to read this book. It was mind blowing. So, but there are times when the classroom can feel chaotic because there's so much more going on and there's so many things happening. You can't listen into all of the things at the same time. So that could be also something that's nerve-wracking. I was particularly worried about knowledge sharing, which is what Peter calls it in the building thinking classrooms, because before I was like, okay, like you're in this group, you need to stay and talk to people in this group. You're in this group, you need to stay and talk to people here. So I was nervous that, you know, people would be cheating or like just taking it to get the answers and not having it. And in his book, he explains that he saw maybe like 5 examples or like a handful. Somehow he could count on his hands of that actually happening. So I was like, okay, I'll give it a try. So there are some things where you're not as in control of what's going to happen. And you kind of have to take a look at it and be like, okay, well, I'll give it a shot and see how it goes and do some modifying from there. And so I've been able to get some other people on board and seeing that we had all been doing task-based because Utah had been implementing is the word I wanted, little by little, task-based for all of our high school kids. So we were all there, but I think this was the missing piece for me in the investigative approach, where it didn't feel like I felt disjointed in my classroom. And I think the building thinking classroom helped me put things so it felt like a better flow for me and more authentic, maybe isn't quite the right word, but it's really helped me out a lot.
Thank you, Kristen. I feel like you dropped so many great strategies and little techniques and expert advice there. We will be sending out the recording to everybody in case there's any part of the session you want to revisit. Before we wrap up, actually, I'm going to ask Kevin, would you mind just commenting on what you've been hearing? Because from the national level and even from your own classroom, how does this all tie back into your work?
Absolutely. I loved hearing Kristen's story, and I love thinking of this as a journey. And as I looked in the chat box with all the comments that were there, people are recognizing this is a different way of teaching than what many of us experienced and what many of us may have started out on our careers. And I love thinking of it as a journey. Not every day is great. Some days are going to go better than others. But if we're truly interested in meeting the needs of our students, we have got to move more towards incorporating more inquiry-based learning, incorporating more discourse. And I just want to amplify Lindsey's comment earlier. It's not an either or. It's not you're either inquiry-based or you're explicit teaching. It's when. They both have a time and place. And we have got to stop this. You're a bad teacher if you're telling the kids what to do, or you're a bad teacher if you're never giving them the inquiry base. It's a both and. You need to find those spots. We need to build that student curiosity, build that engagement with some of those inquiry-based learning. But let's be realistic. A kid's not just going to naturally come up with the word hypotenuse for the longest side of a right triangle. There's a time and a place for the teacher to provide that academic vocabulary, for them to come up with the stuff, and for them to get some of that tying together things with the procedures. So I think that the 2 biggest takeaways that I'm coming up with from listening to all these is it's a journey, and there's a time and a place for both inquiry-based and explicit instruction.
Can I just add back in?
Please.
It's been very nice having both a district and a state that's supportive of like allowing me to have my professionalism and know that I can do some explicit teaching, that I can do some inquiry-based. And so that has been really nice that they respect my professional judgment, and I've never felt judged. Like if my district people come in and see that whatever I'm doing on one day is explicit teaching, it's not going to be like, oh, well, you can't do that. And I know that may not be the case in all of your places. And so I feel for you if that is the case. And that has been really great. And the other thing I was going to say, that there have been some times where I've gone back to my more previous way of teaching, and it just has not gone as well as I had remembered in my brain, and I was like, I'm never doing this again. So it's been a much better, fulfilling job for me professionally. I kind of hit like a down part in my career. I'm not great with words sometimes. I had a down part where I was just struggling to like have that great enthusiasm about my job all the time. And switching over to the building thinking classrooms has brought a lot of that back, where it's much more engaging and much more fun than it was before.
I just appreciate that from top to bottom, we're getting a perspectives from kind of all over the place. And so no matter what role you have, I hope there is something here that you can take with you. I do want to have us look at one final concept before we wrap up our time together. This concept about leading indicators of learning. Not sure how familiar everyone is about this. It might be helpful to actually acknowledge that the opposite of a leading indicator is a lagging indicator of learning. And let's just be honest, we do ask teachers to focus their attention here probably too much. Heather Hill's research finds that the time teachers spend reviewing test scores, I mean, as much as 40 hours per year, actually has no impact on changes in learning outcomes. Yet we still keep like relying on these old systems and old data that we look at. So if you're asking yourself, and if you are making some decisions for your school or district about how to change learning outcomes, we ask you to consider leading indicators, the kinds of things that a teacher can see as it's happening, data they could use tomorrow or even later in their own school day, that can help teachers consider how to make these small shifts in their mindsets that lead to a much richer student experience. The kind of data that we're talking about is student talk data, the kinds of questions that teachers ask, these little adjustments that teachers can make to help bring discourse alive in math classrooms. In terms of the way that TeachFX provides this kind of data to anyone who is interested, the folks that we've had sharing their experience have been using this data. It's all about being able to gather feedback and reflect on discourse that's happening in a teacher's classroom by the teacher themselves. We think that teachers need to have access to these leading indicators, not just twice a year, not just once when they go to a PD, but this has to happen frequently in an objective format where they're the ones empowered to be able to push record and then be able to collect and reflect on that data. We know that they need to have a clear view of the teaching and discourse that's happening in their classroom, and especially without the pressure of maybe a distraction of having someone come and observe and taking notes and subjecting all the data to their own biases. What we hope is that teachers can put those leading indicators to work when they reflect, collaboratively learn in PLCs or in workshops that they can have facilitated by TeachFX or within their sites. I think for the sake of time, I'm actually going to have us just take a look at what the app can do in case, so some of you are wondering, like, what is this recording that Joseph's talking about? Essentially, a teacher that uses this tool can use it on their phone or a tablet or on their computer, whatever that has a microphone, and they just push one button, it's record, and it collects the audio and gives them all of this incredible data about their lesson. And it's really it's really that simple. That's all that they have to do here. If you're wondering what happens with this data, well, the teachers certainly can have a powerful reflection. In addition, what we can do for a school or a district is we can sort of roll up the aggregate data so that instructional leaders can see overall what's happening school-wide or make decisions about where they want to place their focus. And this is all respecting the privacy and anonymity of the teachers that are doing this work in their classrooms. This is from one of our partner schools or partner districts in Utah, Alpine School District, and it's consistent with across all of our partnerships. The more teachers are using this tool, the more they see their student talk increase. And I believe it has a lot to do with the mindset and growth that they go through. Additionally, there's all kinds of other data that we can look at including wait time and questioning. And there's just some really powerful things that we get to see across our partnerships. I want to second the thank you to all of our facilitators and panelists today for sharing your incredible perspectives. It's just been a joy to be able to work alongside you all this year. I want to actually have us open things up to our participants today. I know we're getting close to the hour, but myself, the TeachFX team members and our panelists, I believe, can stay on for a little bit. We'd love to elevate questions that come through either in the chat, or you can come off mute and share your question. And if you have to jump off, it was great to have you as part of our conversation today. Thanks so much for your time.